the trend towards a politically united world because it would inevitably diminish their own power. But most governments are run by intelligent people, and the horrendous cost of the world wars produced by the present international system has driven even governments to think in terms of setting up some world authority to settle their quarrels peacefully. They began trying after the First World War with the League of Nations. That didn't work, and therefore we had the Second World War. So when the victorious great powers made a second attempt to create a world authority in 1945, the United Nations, they gave it the right to enforce its decisions and gave themselves controlling shares. On the surface, the slogan for the new UN could have been one for all and all for one. The idea was formally known as collective security. If one nation attacked another, then all the other UN members would come to the aid of the nation under attack. But the real rules the charter writers devised made it unlikely that this would actually happen very often, because the five major powers of the world all reserved the right to say no. The first test of collective security came in 1950, when war broke out in Korea. But the five great powers who were supposed to run the world had already broken up into two hostile blocs, as the winners usually do after a great war, simply because they're each other's biggest surviving rivals. A UN force was sent to Korea, but it was really just the US Army and its allies under the UN flag. It only happened at all because the Russians had walked out of the Security Council at the time and were not there to use their veto. They never made that mistake again, and since Korea, one or another of the great powers has vetoed every proposal to impose a UN decision by force.
I also have always felt that one has to see the United Nations in a very long perspective. It's no good assuming it's going to work in the first generation. It's not. But I see it as a great human experiment in its very early stages, and if we can make tiny progress on one or two things each year, it's already something. But I don't imagine that in my lifetime it's going to ever reach up to the aspirations which people who don't know about politics have for it.
Collective security is dead. And even in peacekeeping, the UN has to wait to be asked in. Don't call us, we'll call you. Occasionally, some small country gets so desperate it does send for a UN peacekeeping force, as here in Cyprus. And if the great powers don't object, the operation can go ahead. But nobody is ever going to peacekeep on the territory of a great power, and even smaller countries would generally rather settle their disputes privately, by war if necessary. Since the United Nations first met in 1946, there have been at least 75 wars in the world. The first Arab-Israeli War, the first Vietnam War, the Korean War, the first India-Pakistan War, the second Arab-Israeli War, the Algerian War, the Sino-Indian War, the second Vietnam War, the second India-Pakistan War, the third Arab-Israeli War, the third India-Pakistan War, the invasion of Cyprus, the fourth Arab-Israeli War.
Actually, curiously enough, the United Nations, if everybody is frightened enough, it does tend to be extremely useful and quite effective. And particularly that is the case when you have the seeds of a superpower nuclear confrontation.
Not content with the destruction of Cuban independence, not content with the extension of Soviet power into the Western Hemisphere, not content with a challenge to the inter-American system and to the United Nations Charter, has decided to transform Cuba into a base for communist aggression, into a base for putting all of the Americas under the nuclear gun.
The Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest the world has yet come to nuclear war. As American UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson spoke, land-based missiles in Europe and the United States were on alert, ready to be launched at the Soviet Union. American and Soviet bombers carrying nuclear warheads were in the air, and Polaris submarines took up station off the Soviet coast. By putting missiles in Cuba, the Soviet Union had challenged America's nuclear superiority, and all the old responses to a challenge to national power came into play.
I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace and to stable relations between our two nations. I call upon him further to abandon this course of world domination and to join in an historic effort.
It was the same old game. The United States had a huge superiority in nuclear weapons and didn't want to lose it. The Soviet Union felt strategically naked and was trying to narrow the gap by sneaking missiles into Cuba. But the U.S. slapped a naval blockade on Cuba, and the Soviet Union managed to back down behind a facade of bluster at the UN.
All right, sir. Let me ask you one simple question. Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sights in Cuba? Yes or no? Don't wait for the translation, yes or no?
Я не нахожусь в американском суде.
I am not in an American courtroom, sir, and therefore I do not wish to answer a question that is put to me in the fashion in which a prosecutor does. In due course, sir, you will have your reply.
I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, if that's your decision.
The world was not blown up in the Cuban crisis, of course. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev pulled his missiles out of Cuba, and both sides managed to back away from the brink of war with perfect dignity. They did it mostly by pretending to accept the UN's authority. They've done the same thing over Suez and Hungary in 1956, over the Middle East in 1973, and in a number of other crises. The United Nations hasn't brought perfect peace and harmony to the world, but as a survival shelter against the next world war, it hasn't done that badly. If something like it had existed in 1914, maybe Tsar Nicholas would have been able to back out of the First World War. The great powers ignore it whenever they can, but when they need it more than anybody else.
I don't know what the answer is. I think we have to go on trying to prevent the worst from happening. As Hammarskjöld once said, the United Nations was not set up to bring mankind to heaven, but to save it from hell.
Even arms control is something the great powers would rather keep out of UN hands and settle among themselves. The first agreement they made was the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963, soon after they'd thoroughly scared themselves during the Cuban crisis. But it only prohibited atmospheric tests, and since then there have been close to 900 nuclear tests underground. After all, without some kind of test, you couldn't develop new weapons. In 1972, the superpowers actually agreed to control the number of their weapons by the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. But the word limitation was used in a rather special sense. The limits the treaty set were only limits on future growth and allowed the number of nuclear warheads to double in the following decade. The two sides now have about 50,000 nuclear weapons. In 1979, the Americans and the Russians came up with another arms control agreement. It was good public relations for both sides, but détente was breaking down by now, so the treaty didn't get ratified in the end. Besides, neither side is really willing to bargain away the key weapons that it pins its hopes of strategic superiority on. The U.S. wouldn't include multiple warheads in the SALT I agreement. The Soviet Union wouldn't get rid of its huge land-based missiles in SALT II, and the U.S. won't make a deal about Star Wars in the current negotiations. Our institutions, both our national governments and the United Nations, are failing to deliver the necessary assurances that they can guarantee peace,